When a thug decided to slap an elderly woman on a crowded subway train, he had no idea that the quiet man sitting in the corner had survived wars, fought legends, and never backed down from protecting the innocent. Comment where you're watching from today, because this story will remind you that heroes come in the most unexpected forms. The 6:15 p.m. Red Line train rumbled through the underground tunnels of downtown, its fluorescent lights flickering intermittently as dozens of weary commuters swayed with each turn. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, fast food, and the musty smell that seemed to permanently inhabit every subway car. Rush hour had packed the train to capacity, with passengers pressed shoulder to shoulder, some clutching phones, others staring blankly ahead, all eager to reach their destinations and escape the day's exhaustion. Among the sea of faces, one man sat quietly in the corner seat near the back of the car. Sylvester Stallone appeared unremarkable at first glance, a man in his 70s wearing a simple grey hoodie and dark jeans, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees. His face bore the lines of someone who had lived through decades of both triumph and struggle, yet his eyes remained alert, constantly scanning the environment with the awareness of someone who had learned never to let his guard down completely. To most passengers, he was just another tired commuter heading home, invisible in the way that older people often become in a world obsessed with youth and status. 3 rows ahead, an elderly woman named Dorothy Westbrook clutched her worn leather purse tightly against her chest. At 82, she had been riding public transportation for over 6 decades, but lately the city felt different, more aggressive, less patient. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and despite her modest clothing, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had raised 5 children, worked 2 jobs for most of her adult life, and never asked for anything she hadn't earned. The shopping bag at her feet contained groceries she had carefully budgeted for, each item selected with the precision of someone living on a fixed income. The train lurched to a stop at Central Station, and a group of young men pushed their way aboard, their loud voices cutting through the general murmur of conversation. The leader of the group, a man in his mid-20s named Travis Blackwood, stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and defiance. His crew, Anthony Morse, Derek Sullivan, and Jake Henderson, followed. Behind him like shadows, their swagger and aggressive postures immediately shifting the energy in the car. They wore expensive sneakers and designer clothing that seemed to contradict their confrontational attitudes, as if they were trying to prove something to a world that had never given them the respect they felt they deserved. Travis surveyed the crowded car with predatory eyes, looking for weakness, for opportunities to assert dominance in the small kingdom of public transportation. His gaze lingered on well-dressed business people, elderly passengers, and anyone who looked like they might be intimidated by his presence. This was his theater, his stage where he could perform the role of someone powerful and feared, even if that power extended only to the length of a subway ride. The train pulled away from the station with a mechanical groan, and Travis began to move through the car, his friends flanking him as they pushed past seated passengers without apology. Their conversation was punctuated with profanity and boastful stories about fights they claimed to have won, money they claimed to have made, and people they claimed to have conquered. Each word was calculated to draw attention, to make everyone around them uncomfortable and aware of their presence. Dorothy Westbrook tried to make herself smaller in her seat, recognizing the type of trouble that had just boarded her train. She had seen young men like this before, angry at the world, looking for someone to blame for their frustrations, quick to violence when they felt disrespected or ignored. Her strategy had always been to remain invisible, to avoid eye contact, and to hope that their attention would focus elsewhere. But invisibility was a luxury that Travis Blackwood would not allow her to maintain. As the group moved through the car, Travis noticed Dorothy's expensive-looking watch, a gift from her late husband 40 years ago that she had never had the heart to replace despite its age. To his untrained eye, it looked valuable, and her careful attempt to hide it by pulling down her sleeve only drew more attention to what she was trying to conceal. "Excuse me, Grandma," Travis said, his voice dripping with false politeness as he stopped directly in front of Dorothy's seat. The entire car seemed to hold its breath as conversations died and passengers pretended to look at their phones while keeping their peripheral vision trained on the unfolding confrontation. Dorothy looked up reluctantly, her eyes meeting Travis's, for just a moment before darting away. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the train's mechanical symphony. "That's a nice watch you got there," Travis continued, his friends positioning themselves to block any potential escape. "Routes must have cost you a pretty penny. What's an old lady like you doing with something so fancy? You hiding money from the government or something?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she pulled her sleeves down further, trying to cover the watch completely. "It was my husband's," she said quietly, hoping that mentioning her deceased spouse would invoke some sense of decency in the young man towering over her. Anthony Morse laughed harshly from behind Travis. "Her husband's," she says, "like we're supposed to believe some old man bought his wife a Rolex on a pension check. Come on, lady, what's the real story? You dealing drugs to the other senior citizens at your building?" The suggestion was so absurd and cruel that several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked around nervously, hoping someone else would intervene, but the unspoken rule of public transportation held firm. Mind your own business, avoid confrontation, and hope the situation resolves itself without violence. Derek Sullivan stepped closer, his presence adding another layer of intimidation to the scene. "Maybe she's one of those old ladies who scams people on the internet. You know how they are, acting all innocent while they're stealing social security numbers and credit card information." Dorothy's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I would never. I'm not," she stammered, her voice breaking, as the weight of their accusations pressed down on her like a physical force. "Save it, Grandma," Travis interrupted, his patience wearing thin as the train approached the next station. "We all know how you old-timers operate, acting all sweet and helpless while you're running schemes behind everyone's back. That watch probably came from some poor family you conned out of their inheritance." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears, not just from the cruelty of their words, but from the helplessness she felt in the face of such unprovoked aggression. She had lived through the Great Depression, raised children during wartime, and survived the death of her beloved husband. But this moment of public humiliation felt somehow worse than all of those challenges combined. Jake Henderson, not to be, outdone by his companions, leaned down until his face was inches from Dorothy's. "You know what I think? I think you need to show some respect to your betters. We're young, we're strong, and we're not afraid of anything. You're old, weak, and probably don't have much time left anyway. So why don't you just hand over that watch, and we'll call it even?" The demand was delivered with a smile that contained no warmth, only the predatory satisfaction of someone who enjoyed wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. The train car had become completely silent, except for the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks and the occasional whisper of fabric as passengers shifted nervously in their seats. Dorothy's grip on her purse tightened until her knuckles turned white. The watch wasn't valuable in monetary terms. It was a simple timepiece that her husband had bought at a discount store decades ago, but it represented 47 years of marriage, countless anniversaries, and the steady passage of time that had brought both joy and sorrow to her life. The idea of surrendering it to these young men felt like betraying her husband's memory and everything they had built together. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all I have left of him." Travis's expression hardened at what he perceived as defiance. All you have left. Lady, you're about to have a lot less if you don't start showing some cooperation. We're trying to be nice here, but our patience has limits. The threat was unmistakable, and the tension in the car ratcheted up another notch as passengers began to calculate their own safety against their moral obligation to help someone in need. Several people pulled out their phones, but whether to call for help or simply to record whatever was about to happen remained unclear. Anthony Morse cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound echoing through the car like gunshots. Maybe she needs a little encouragement to understand the situation better. Sometimes old people have trouble hearing, you know? The suggestion of violence caused a ripple of movement through the car as some passengers tried to edge away from the confrontation, while others leaned forward slightly, torn between self-preservation and the desire to witness whatever was about to unfold. Dorothy looked around desperately, searching for a friendly face, someone who might offer help or at least moral support. Her eyes swept past businessmen in expensive suits who suddenly found their newspapers fascinating, young professionals who became absorbed in their smartphones, and middle-aged commuters who stared intently out the windows at the dark tunnel, walls rushing past. But in the corner near the back of the car, she caught sight of an older man whose steady gaze met hers without flinching. Unlike everyone else on the train, he wasn't looking away or pretending to be busy with something else. His eyes held a quality she hadn't seen in a long time, the look of someone who had faced real danger and wasn't impressed by the theatrical aggression being displayed in front of him. Sylvester Stallone had been watching the situation develop from the moment Travis and his friends had boarded the train. He had seen this type of behavior before, in back alleys and boxing gyms, in war zones and movie sets where real violence was sometimes just a breath away from the choreographed kind. He recognized the signs of young men trying to prove their toughness by picking on someone who couldn't fight back, and he knew exactly where this confrontation was heading. The train began to slow as it approached the next station, and Travis sensed that his window of opportunity was closing. The performance had gone on long enough, and now it was time for action that would cement his reputation and satisfy his need for dominance. "You know what, Grandma?" he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I think you need a lesson in respect, maybe a little physical reminder about how things work in the real world." He raised his hand, and the entire car seemed to freeze in anticipation of what was about to happen. Dorothy closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible, bracing for the impact that seemed inevitable. But before Travis could complete his motion, a quiet voice from the back of the car cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That's enough." The words hung in the air with a weight that seemed to defy their simplicity. Every head in the subway car turned toward the source of that quiet command, and for the first time since boarding the train, Travis Blackwood felt something he wasn't accustomed to experiencing: uncertainty. Sylvester Stallone rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 77 years old, he didn't possess the explosive speed he'd once commanded in the ring or on movie sets, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of decades spent in situations where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. His grey hoodie hung loosely on his frame, but beneath the casual clothing, the remnants of a once powerful physique were still evident in the breadth of his shoulders and the way he carried himself with absolute confidence. "I'm sorry, old man," Travis said, his voice carrying forced bravado as he tried to reassert control over the situation. "But this isn't your business. We're just having a conversation with the lady here about her expensive jewelry. Nothing for you to worry about?" Anthony Morse snickered from his position near Dorothy's seat. "Yeah, Grandpa. Why don't you sit back down before you hurt yourself? This train's got a lot of stops and turns, and someone your age could take a nasty fall if they're not careful." The threat was thinly veiled, but Sylvester didn't acknowledge it with even a flicker of expression. Instead, he began walking slowly down the aisle toward the confrontation, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Other passengers pressed themselves back into their seats as he passed, sensing something in his demeanor that suggested this wasn't going to end the way most subway altercations did, with the victims surrendering to avoid violence. "The conversation's over," Sylvester said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced the car moments before. "The lady doesn't want to talk to you anymore, and you're making everyone else uncomfortable. Time to move on." Derek Sullivan stepped forward, trying to position himself between Sylvester and Travis. At 32, he was the oldest member of the group and had appointed himself as the strategic thinker of their little crew. "Listen, Pops, I respect that you're trying to be a good Samaritan and all, but you're misreading this situation. We're not bothering anybody, just making friendly conversation with our fellow passengers." Jake Henderson laughed harshly. "Friendly? On conversation, I like that. Yeah, we're being real friendly here, maybe too friendly for some people to handle." The mockery in their voices was designed to humiliate Sylvester, to make him back down and retreat to his seat in embarrassment. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before with other would-be heroes who had second thoughts when faced with the reality of 4 young men willing to use violence to get their way. But Sylvester had faced down opponents who made these 4 look like children playing dress-up. He had stood across from Apollo Creed, had traded blows with Ivan Drago, had stared into the eyes of men who killed for a living and never blinked. The posturing and intimidation tactics being employed by Travis and his crew were amateur hour, compared to the psychological warfare he had endured in professional boxing rings and on movie sets where real stunts sometimes went wrong. "Dorothy," Sylvester said, addressing the elderly woman directly while keeping his eyes fixed on Travis, "are you enjoying this conversation with these young men?" Dorothy looked up with tears still glistening in her eyes, surprised to hear her name spoken by someone who had clearly been paying attention to more than just the surface drama unfolding in the car. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying enough conviction to cut through the ambient noise of the moving train. "No, I'm not." "There you have it," Sylvester said, spreading his hands as if the matter was settled. "The lady's not interested in continuing your conversation. Time for you to find someone else to talk to." Travis felt his authority slipping away as other passengers began to murmur among themselves, and several people pulled out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a more serious confrontation. The dynamic in the car had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Instead of 4 young men intimidating a helpless old woman, it was now 4 young men facing off against someone who didn't seem particularly intimidated by their numbers or their aggressive posturing. "You know what your problem is, old man?" Travis said, stepping closer to Sylvester with his chest puffed out in what he hoped was an intimidating display. "You think because you lived through the good old days when people were polite and respectful that the world still works that way. But this isn't 1950 anymore. This is the real world, where strength matters and weakness gets you stepped on." Anthony Morse nodded enthusiastically. "That's right. And you're looking pretty weak right now, Grandpa. 4 against 1, and you're what, 70 years old? Maybe older? What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" The mathematics of the situation weren't lost on the other passengers, many of whom had initially felt a spark of hope when Sylvester had stood up to the group. But now, faced with the reality of the age and numbers disparity, several people began looking toward the doors, calculating whether they could escape when the train reached the next station without getting caught up in whatever violence was about to erupt. Sylvester took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Travis until they were standing less than 3 feet apart. "You want to know what I think is going to happen?" he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly throughout. The car. I think you're going to apologize to Dorothy for frightening her, and then you're going to find seats somewhere else on this train. Derek Sullivan laughed incredulously. Apologize? Are you serious? We don't apologize to anybody, especially not some old bag who's probably been living off welfare her whole life, while honest people like us work for everything we get. The insult hit Dorothy like a physical blow, and she hunched further into her seat as if trying to disappear entirely. She had worked as a seamstress for 43 years, had raised 5 children mostly on her own after her husband was injured in a factory accident, and had never taken a government handout in her entire life. The suggestion that she was somehow less deserving of respect because of her age and economic status felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed and endured. Jake Henderson sensed an opportunity to escalate the situation and cement their dominance. You know what I think the real problem is here? I think some people don't understand their place in the food chain. Old people, they had their time, and now it's over. They need to step aside and let the younger generation take charge. Travis's trapped arm as a lever to spin the younger man around and position him between Sylvester and the other 2 attackers. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, but when it was over, both Travis and Jake found themselves held like puppets by a man who seemed to have an unlimited supply of steel cable where his fingers should have been. Jake's knife hand was twisted at an angle that made it impossible for him to use the weapon effectively, while Travis discovered that his arm was now bent behind his back in a position that sent shooting pains through his shoulder every time he tried to move. Now we have a problem, Sylvester said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than restraining 2 armed men who had been threatening violence moments before. You brought a weapon into this situation, which means we've moved beyond simple harassment into felony territory. That changes things considerably. Anthony Morse and Derek Sullivan found themselves facing a tactical nightmare. Their 2 companions were being held by an opponent who had demonstrated capabilities they hadn't anticipated, and any attempt to rush him would put Travis and Jake in danger of being seriously injured. Moreover, the ease with which the old man had neutralized 2 of their number suggested that he might be considerably more dangerous than his appearance indicated. Let them go, Anthony demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. You're making this worse. For everybody, we were just having a little fun with the old lady. Nobody was going to get seriously hurt. Fun, Sylvester repeated, his tone suggesting that he found the characterization less than convincing. Dorothy, were you having fun during your conversation with these gentlemen? Dorothy shook her head vigorously, tears still streaming down her face. No, she whispered. I was terrified. I thought they were going to hurt me. There you have it, Sylvester said, addressing Anthony and Derek while maintaining his grip on their companions. Doesn't sound like fun to me. Sounds like assault, harassment, and intimidation. Add the knife and we're looking at armed assault. That's serious prison time in this state. The mention of prison sent a chill through all 4 young men. They had operated under the assumption that their victims would be too intimidated or too afraid to press charges, and that any witnesses would be too concerned about their own safety to get involved. The presence of an opponent who seemed not only unafraid, but actively documenting their crimes for potential prosecution was a scenario they hadn't prepared for. Derek tried a different approach, appealing to what he assumed was Sylvester's desire, to avoid further conflict. Look, maybe we got a little carried away here. We're sorry about that. Why don't we just call this whole thing even and go our separate ways? No harm, no foul. No harm? Sylvester asked, glancing at Dorothy's tear-streaked face and trembling hands. Look at her, Derek. Does she look like someone who hasn't been harmed? The question forced Derek to actually look at the elderly woman they had been tormenting, and, for the first time, he seemed to register the human cost of their actions. Dorothy was huddled in her seat like a wounded animal, clutching her purse to her chest and looking around the car as if expecting another attack at any moment. The confident, dignified woman who had boarded the train had been replaced by someone who looked broken and afraid. Jake tried to twist his arm free from Sylvester's grip, but the attempt only resulted in more pain as the older man adjusted his hold to prevent any possibility of escape. "You're going to pay for this, old man," Jake hissed through gritted teeth. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we'll find you. We'll make you regret ever getting involved in our business." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and several passengers shifted nervously as they realized that the confrontation might not end when the train reached its destination. These were young men who clearly had experience with violence and intimidation, and the prospect of ongoing retaliation added another layer of danger to an already volatile situation. But Sylvester seemed remarkably unimpressed by the threat. "You know, Jake," he said conversationally, "I've been threatened by professional killers, mob enforcers, and men who made their living hurting people. Compared to them, you're not particularly scary." Travis tried once more to break free, putting all his strength into a desperate attempt to wrench his arm away from the iron grip that held him. The effort was not only unsuccessful, but resulted in a sharp increase in the pressure on his wrist that sent shooting pains up his arm and into his shoulder. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Sylvester said quietly. "I've been very gentle so far, but my patience has limits. Keep struggling, and you might discover that some old dogs still have very sharp teeth." The train began to slow as it approached. The next station, and the electronic announcement system crackled to life with information about the upcoming stop. Several passengers were already gathering near the doors, clearly intending to exit as quickly as possible when the opportunity presented itself. But others remained in their seats, held in place by a mixture of fascination and the growing realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Anthony Morse looked around the car desperately, hoping to find some advantage he could exploit or some ally who might help even the odds. But what he saw instead were dozens of passengers with their phones out, recording every moment of the confrontation for potential use by law enforcement. The anonymous crowd that had initially seemed indifferent to their victim's plight had transformed into a jury of witnesses documenting their crimes in high definition. "This isn't over," Anthony said, his voice carrying a desperation that hadn't been there before. "You think you're some kind of hero, old man? You think saving one old lady makes you special? There are 4 of us, and 1 of you, and sooner or later, the math is going to catch up with you." Sylvester considered this assessment for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You might be right about the math," he said finally, "but you're making the mistake of assuming that all variables in the equation are equal. Age, experience, training, and motivation, they all factor into the final calculation." The philosophical discussion was interrupted by Derek, who had apparently decided that a direct assault was their only remaining option. With a shout of rage, he charged forward, his fists swinging wildly as he tried to overwhelm Sylvester through sheer aggression and desperation. What happened next would be replayed on social media platforms around the world within hours of the train reaching its destination. Derek Sullivan's charge was fueled by desperation rather than strategy, a wild rush that spoke more to his panic than his fighting ability. He had expected to overwhelm an elderly man through sheer momentum and youthful aggression, but what he encountered instead was something that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. Sylvester Stallone didn't move his feet. He didn't release his grip on Travis and Jake. Instead, with surgical precision that spoke of decades spent in situations where a single mistake meant unconsciousness or worse, he simply shifted his weight and drove his left elbow backward into Derek's solar plexus. As the younger man rushed past him, the impact was devastating. Derek's charge came to an abrupt halt as all the air was driven from his lungs in a single explosive gasp. He doubled over, clutching his chest and making choking sounds as his body struggled to remember how to breathe. The confident street fighter who had been threatening violence moments before was reduced to a gasping, helpless figure collapsed on the subway floor. "Derek!" Anthony shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear as he watched his friend writhe in agony. "What did you do to him?" "I taught him that momentum without technique is just another word for stupidity," Sylvester replied, calmly, still maintaining his iron grip on Travis and Jake, while Derek struggled to regain his breath on the floor of the subway car. The passengers in the car watched in stunned silence as the dynamics of the confrontation shifted once again. What had begun as four young men intimidating an elderly woman had evolved into a masterclass in controlled violence delivered by someone who clearly understood the difference between brutality and precision. Travis felt the grip on his wrist tighten as he processed what had just happened to Derek. The casual efficiency with which the old man had neutralized his friend suggested reserves of skill and experience that went far beyond anything Travis had encountered in his limited experience with street violence. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rumble of the train. Sylvester glanced at him with something that might have been amusement. "Just someone who believes that people like Dorothy deserve to ride the train without being terrorized by people like you." Jake tried once more to twist free from the grip that held his knife hand immobilized, but the attempt only resulted in a subtle adjustment that sent fresh waves of pain shooting up his arm. "This is impossible," he gasped. "You're old. You're supposed to be weak." "Age is just a number, Jake," Sylvester said conversationally. "What matters is what you do with the years you're given. Some people waste them, others use them to learn things that can't be taught in a classroom or picked up in a street fight." Anthony Morse found himself facing a tactical nightmare. Two of his companions were being held by an opponent who had demonstrated capabilities none of them had anticipated, while the third was still struggling to breathe on the floor of the subway car. The smartphones recording their humiliation would ensure that their failure became a permanent part of the internet, and the potential legal consequences of their actions were beginning to penetrate their consciousness. "Look," Anthony said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that would have been unthinkable minutes earlier. "Maybe we can work something out here. We didn't really hurt anybody. The old lady is fine. Nobody got seriously injured. Why don't we just forget this whole thing happened?" Dorothy Westbrook looked up at Anthony with tears still glistening in her eyes. "Fine," she repeated, her voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation began. "You think I'm fine? You think terrorizing an old woman for her late husband's watch is something that should just be forgotten?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and for the first time since boarding the train, Anthony seemed to register the human cost of their actions. Dorothy wasn't just a target or a victim, she was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, a human being who had been going about her business until they decided to make her their prey. The train continued to slow as it approached the station, and the electronic announcement system provided updates on the upcoming stop. Several passengers were now openly filming the confrontation, their phones capturing every word and gesture for potential use by law enforcement or social media platforms. Derek had finally managed to regain enough breath to speak, though his voice was weak and strained. "I can't feel my fingers," he wheezed from his position on the floor. "What did you do to me?" "Reminded you that actions have consequences," Sylvester replied without looking down at him. "The feeling will come back in a few minutes, along with a very clear memory of why you shouldn't charge at people without knowing what you're dealing with." Jake's knife had become a liability rather than an asset, trapped in a grip that made it impossible to use effectively while serving as evidence of his intent to cause serious harm. "Just let us go," he pleaded, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "We'll get off at the next stop and you'll never see us again." "I'm sure that's true," Sylvester said thoughtfully. "The question is whether Dorothy will ever feel safe riding public transportation again after what you put her through. Whether she'll be able to sleep tonight without worrying about the next group of young men who decide that terrorizing elderly women is an acceptable form of entertainment." The psychological dimension of their crime was something that none of the four young men had considered. They had focused on the immediate gratification of exerting power over someone weaker than themselves, without thinking about the lasting trauma their actions might cause. The idea that their victim might carry the fear and humiliation with her for weeks or months to come was a concept that seemed to genuinely surprise them. Travis tried a different approach, appealing to what he assumed was Sylvester's sense of mercy. "We're sorry, okay? We made a mistake. People make mistakes all the time. Does that really mean our lives should be ruined over one stupid incident on a subway train?" "That depends," Sylvester said, his tone suggesting that he was genuinely considering the question. "Are you sorry because you understand that what you did was wrong? Or are you sorry because you got caught and neutralized by someone you thought would be an easy target?" The distinction was important, and Travis struggled to formulate an answer that would satisfy his captor while remaining true to his own worldview. The truth was that he was primarily sorry about getting caught and humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses, but admitting that would hardly improve his situation. Anthony made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "You know what your problem is, old man. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just another violent thug who happens to be on the other side of this fight. You hurt Derek. You're holding Travis and Jake against their will. How does that make you any better than us?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the moral landscape that governs such situations. Anthony was attempting to create a false equivalence between initiating violence and responding to it, between targeting the innocent and protecting them. Sylvester considered the accusation for a moment before responding. "The difference, Anthony, is that I didn't start this confrontation. I didn't board this train looking for someone to intimidate or harm. I was content to mind my own business until you and your friends decided that terrorizing Dorothy was an acceptable way to spend your afternoon." The train came to a complete stop, and the doors opened with a mechanical hiss that seemed to punctuate the conversation. Several passengers immediately exited, clearly eager to escape the tension and potential violence that still filled the car. But others remained, either unwilling to miss the conclusion of the confrontation or concerned about leaving Dorothy alone with her tormentors. Derek managed to struggle to his feet, though he remained hunched over and continued to clutch his chest. "Can we just go?" he gasped. "Please, we won't bother anybody else. We'll get off here and find another train." "That's not really up to me," Sylvester said, glancing toward the platform where he could see transit police officers beginning to board the train. "It looks like other people have made that decision for us." The appearance of law enforcement changed the entire dynamic of the situation. What had been a contained confrontation between passengers was about to become an official incident, with potential criminal charges and legal consequences. The smartphones that had been recording their humiliation would now serve as evidence in whatever legal proceedings followed. Travis felt his knees go weak as he processed the implications. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no. This can't be happening. We didn't do anything that bad. People get hassled on the subway all the time. This is just normal city life." "Normal city life," Dorothy repeated, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the car, including herself. "Is that what you call terrorizing an elderly woman, threatening to steal her late husband's watch, pulling a knife on someone who tried to help?" The questions forced Travis to confront the reality of his actions in a way that his earlier justifications had allowed him to avoid. When stripped of the rhetoric about strength and weakness, natural selection and survival of the fittest, what remained was the simple fact that they had chosen to make another human being afraid for their own amusement. Jake made one final desperate attempt to escape, putting all his remaining strength into trying to break free from Sylvester's grip. But the effort was not only unsuccessful, it resulted in a subtle adjustment of pressure that sent him to his knees, the knife clattering to the floor as his hand went numb. "I wouldn't recommend trying that again," Sylvester said quietly, maintaining his grip even as Jake collapsed. "I've been very patient so far, but patience isn't infinite." The transit police officers entered the car with the confident stride of professionals who had dealt with similar situations countless times before. They quickly assessed the scene, an elderly man restraining two younger suspects while a third sat on the floor nursing what appeared to be significant injuries, with dozens of witnesses recording everything on their phones. "Everyone stay calm," the lead officer announced. "We're going to sort this out step by step. Who wants to tell me what happened here?" Before anyone else could speak, Dorothy Westbrook raised her trembling hand. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the car despite its fragility. "These four young men threatened me, tried to steal my watch, and pulled a knife when this gentleman tried to help me, and I want to press charges against every single one of them." The declaration sent a chill through Travis, Anthony, Derek, and Jake as they realized that their afternoon of entertainment was about to become a very expensive and long-lasting nightmare. The legal system they had assumed would protect them from the consequences of their actions was about to demonstrate why preying on the innocent was never as risk-free as it appeared. Sylvester slowly released his grip on Travis and Jake, stepping back as the officers moved in to take control of the situation. As the handcuffs clicked into place and the suspects were read their rights, he turned to Dorothy with a gentle smile. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded respect throughout the confrontation. Dorothy looked up at him with tears of gratitude rather than fear. "I am now," she said softly. "Thank you for reminding me that there are still good people in this world." As the train prepared to continue its journey with 4 fewer passengers than it had carried into the station, the remaining travelers found themselves part of a story that would be shared and retold countless times in the days to come. They had witnessed something rare in the modern world, a moment when justice was swift, decisive, and delivered by someone who understood that true strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And in the corner seat where it had all begun, Sylvester Stallone sat quietly once again, just another passenger riding the train home, carrying with him the satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes, when it really matters, age and experience can still triumph over youth and arrogance.